Hello, this is Max. The life of a vagrant musician trying addiction changes when he meets a stray ginger cat. Don't forget to subscribe. The movie begins in the streets of London, where our main character, James Bowen, a homeless man, performs songs with great passion. Despite his heartfelt performance, he receives neither attention or money from any pedestrians. Instead, someone offers him an unfinished box of sandwiches. At night, James, feeling hungry, reluctantly searches for trash cans for leftover food. Later, while looking for a place to stay, he encounters his friend Baz, who is addicted to drugs. Baz asks James about the nearest drug dealer, but James, who has recently quit drugs, claims ignorance before walking away. Following this encounter, James enters a restaurant and orders food, but upon counting the coins in his pocket, he realizes he doesn't have enough to pay for the meal. Desperate, he offers to sing a song for the customers in exchange for the remaining amount of money. However, the rude owner throws the food into a sink and angrily demands that James leave the restaurant. Depressed about the state of his life, James wanders the empty streets in search of a safe place to stay. To his surprise, he encounters Baz again, sitting inside a car that belongs to a forgetful businessman who left the doors unlocked. In the rain, James joins Baz in the car without objection. He also consumes a small amount of narcotics to escape from the hardships of the day. The next morning, when the owner of the car arrives and discovers James still inside, he becomes enraged. Baz manages to escape, but James is unconscious. Upon witnessing James' condition, the car owner becomes fearful and calls an ambulance to take him to the nearby hospital. Fortunately, James regains consciousness after a few hours, and the situation is not as serious as initially thought. Resting in the hospital, he is approached by Val, his emergency social contact and rehabilitation consultant, who expresses anger at James for consuming a prohibited drug and failing to take his prescribed medication. James sincerely apologizes to Val and promises that it will never happen again. After being discharged from the hospital, James meets Val at her office, where they discuss his new treatment plan. Val prescribes him a new dose of methadone and strictly instructs him to visit her every 2 weeks. Once James leaves, he heads straight to the streets and begins singing again. Meanwhile, Val has a discussion with our senior about James, expressing her desire to secure a room for him to get him off the streets and away from negative influences. To her delight, our senior approves of the idea. Later, Val shares the good news with James, who is overjoyed at the prospect of having a proper apartment. However, Val reminds him that he must continue following the rehabilitation plan diligently. In the evening, while James is taking a bath, he hears a noise coming from the kitchen. Fearful, he wraps a towel around his waist and grabs a shoe for protection before investigating. To his surprise, he finds a small brown cat near his box of cereal. Recognizing the cat's hunger, James feels an immediate connection and offers it some milk. He allows the cat to spend the night in the house and even sings a lovely song for it. The next morning, James carries the cat and goes door to door in the neighborhood, trying to find its owner. Unfortunately, none of the neighbors claim the cat, and James reluctantly leaves it on the streets, hoping it will find its way home. Afterward, James heads to the streets and resumes singing songs as usual. However, his singing becomes an annoyance to an old man who orders him to leave. While James is packing his belongings, he suddenly spots his father, Jack, on the other side of the street and rushes to meet him. It is revealed that James has been abandoned by his family after his father married another woman named Hillary, who dislikes James's presence. As James and his father converse, Hillary arrives and pulls Jack away, declaring that James will never be invited to their Christmas celebration. Before leaving, Jack gives James some money and hints that he might consider inviting him for dinner. Later, when James returns home, he finds the same cat waiting outside. He gently picks it up and notices that it has wounds all over its body. Concerned, James contacts his animal-loving neighbor, Betty, who suggests taking the cat to a nearby vet clinic. She also gives the cat the name Bob. Hurriedly, James visits the clinic and spends all his money on medicine for Bob. In the process, he misses his scheduled meeting with Val. Back at home, James attempts to administer the medicine to Bob but fails. Feeling defeated, he turns to Betty for help. Betty, who has volunteered at the vet clinic before, effortlessly handles the task. During their interaction, She opens up to James and reveals her disdain for drugs and those who use them. In response, James lies about his profession, claiming to be a musician. The next day, James goes to Val's office to apologize for missing their scheduled meeting. He then tells Val about his cat and his growing closeness with Betty. However, Val remains skeptical about James's recovery and advises him to focus on taking care of himself rather than getting into relationships. Taking Val's advice, James decides to drop the cat off on the streets. But to his surprise, when he boards a bus, Bob follows him and sits on his lap. The passengers on the bus praise the adorable cat, and the ticket collector even gives James shoelaces to use as a makeshift leash. When James gets off the bus, he carries Bob on his shoulders and heads to his usual spot. Surprisingly, a large crowd gathers to watch him perform, and they generously tip him, resulting in his highest collection yet. James is elated that the cat has brought him recognition and love, so he decides to keep it. He also buys proper food for Bob before returning home. In a subsequent scene, while James is looking for a place to perform, he encounters Baz, who asks for money to buy food. Despite feeling sad for his friend's condition, James offers him some money out of sympathy before continuing on his way. During his performance, James attracts an even larger audience than before. In addition to receiving cat food, an elderly woman presents Bob with a scarf she knitted in memory of her late cat. Later that day, James unexpectedly runs into Betty and invites her to dinner. Betty mentions she's a vegan but still invites James to her apartment for a meal. They have a great time together, but on his way back home, James discovers Baz lying unconscious on the sidewalk. He desperately asks nearby people to call an ambulance, but sadly, Baz has already passed away due to an overdose. James is devastated by this realization. Following Baz's death, James visits Betty again, and she reveals that her own brother died of an overdose. This revelation further strengthens James's determination to stay away from narcotics. In his next meeting with Val, James expresses his desperation to quit using drugs and asks for a reduction in his methadone dosage. However, Val advises him to proceed cautiously, as abruptly quitting narcotics can have negative effects on his mental and physical health. Val assures James that if he continues to abstain from drugs and follows the recommended methadone dosage, they will consider reducing it in the future. The scene then shifts to James and Betty having a special Christmas celebration together. They also go on a date, and James makes a commitment to Betty. However, later that evening, when James decides to celebrate Christmas at his father's place and brings a bottle of wine as a gift, his family treats him like an addict despite his long period of sobriety. Even his stepsisters disrespect him. During a conversation with his father, Bob unexpectedly jumps out of James's lap and causes chaos, knocking over an expensive vase and other items. As a result, Hillary yells at James and his father, leading to James being expelled from the house. The next day, while James is performing in front of a large audience, a dog unexpectedly urinates on his guitar bag, leading to an altercation between James and the dog owner. Authorities arrive and detain James for causing chaos in public. Fortunately, the CCTV footage proves James's innocence, and Val comes to his rescue at the police station. However, James is prohibited from performing in public for 6 months. Val notices that James has not been taking his prescribed methadone and warns him that he must start taking it if he wants to keep Bob with him. Worried about losing his only companion, James rushes to the nearby clinic and takes his dose of methadone. To his surprise, he encounters Betty at the clinic, who learns that James is actually a heroin addict. Angry and hurt by his lies, Betty confronts him for breaking her trust. With his source of income and girlfriend gone, James returns home and later applies for a job as a paper seller at a newspaper company. He is hired but reminded to sell papers within his assigned region. James starts selling papers and attracts strangers who want to take pictures with Bob. However, his competitor vendor complains about him selling papers in his region, leading to James being prohibited from selling papers for a month. James tries to make amends with Betty, but she remains furious and refuses to speak to him. Despite his poor condition, James chooses to prioritize purchasing food for Bob over himself. He starts performing songs by the side of the road and location where the police won't easily find him. Unfortunately, Betty witnesses his actions and shouts at him, ending their relationship. After a month, James returns to selling newspapers. One day, a woman tries to buy Bob from him, and when James refuses, her dogs bark at Bob, causing him to run away. James tries to catch up with Bob but fails. He feels alone and upset, but he resists the temptation to turn back to narcotics. Thankfully, Bob eventually returns home, and James realizes that he is ready to stop using methadone. He visits Val and asks her to reduce his methadone dosage, which she agrees to, advising him to prepare for withdrawal symptoms. James reconciles with Betty and informs her about his drug detox plan. She agrees to assist him by delivering meals to his room. After enduring a week of excruciating withdrawal symptoms, James successfully stops using drugs. He visits Betty, who is about to move out of the city, but she gives him her new address, hoping he will visit her. A book writing business contacts James after seeing footage of him and Bob performing together and asks him to write a book about their friendship. James is introduced to the chief of the writing department, who provides him with a new laptop to begin his work. James goes to his father's house to share the news of his sobriety, which makes his father happy. His father acknowledges his fault and apologizes for leaving James behind. In the final scene, James is greeted by a large audience at the book launch event, and Val, Jack, and Betty congratulate him on his achievement. James expresses gratitude to everyone who supported him throughout his challenging journey in a statement. The movie ends with James and Bob doing what they love most, performing on the streets. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen, and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.